Hey you guys, this is Professor Vid, and I'm here to walk you through the mock exam for Philosophy 15, Political Philosophy. So very roughly, there are going to be a few different kinds of question types on this exam. So let's start at the beginning, and I'll just give you a rough overview. Every question that is included on the mock exam won't be on the regular exam. I'm not going to tell you which ones, but you won't need to know all of these in order to get a great grade on the exam. So you'll notice that we have, to start off, true and false with some multiple choice. Then, once we're done with that, we do short answer and matching. So the short answers are going to be here somewhat. And then number 18 is really the only matching question. And the way it's set up on Moodle is you will have these values on the left and these values on the right, but they won't necessarily be in that order. So you will need to understand the relationship between the highest form of resolution being verbal combat. That's what Socrates thinks we should engage in as a new way of life, as opposed to the Athenian virtue of physical combat over here, which is considered the highest form of resolution under Athenian culture. Then we have a series of short answers about mostly the Republic. And then we have passage identification and explanation. Now, this time around, we really only have two texts that we're talking about, the Defense of Socrates and the Republic. There's one additional text that we covered in class, and that's the passage by Ta-Nehisi Coates. But that will come at the very end, and it's so distinctive and it's so modern and contemporary that I think you'll be able to pick it up. So let's go through each one of these questions and get you guys on the road to a great grade. All right, so first off, this is a true and false question. Here we go, and I think you can read it pretty well. Let me see if I can increase it once more. Barely, only just. Let me see if I can do this for you. Okay, that looks much better, hopefully, to you. All right, number one. Plato, in reacting to Aristotle, thinks you can find virtue in moderation. For example, property should not be entirely communal, nor should it be entirely private. Rather, one should have a blend of private ownership and public use. Now, if you're just reading very carefully and you're consulting your handy-dandy handout, you would think, oh yeah, this sounds right? Aristotle talks about extremes of behavior, and usually virtue is the golden mean. It's this sort of point of moderation, which is better than either an extremity or a deficiency. But if you were reading carefully, right, notice I phrased it that way, you will notice that this thought pattern, the golden mean, is actually attributed to Plato, not its proper source, Aristotle. See, I have written this: Plato, in reacting to Aristotle, thinks you can find virtue in moderation. So, first question out of the gate is a trick. It's a reading comprehension question, right? You might read it and say, oh, this sounds familiar to me. We talked about extremes of behavior and so forth, and how virtue might be a sort of middle ground between two extremes. That sounds right. I'm going to hit true, but you would get it wrong, right? Because it's not Plato who reacts to Aristotle, but Aristotle who reacts to Plato. Remember, it goes SPA, S-P-A. Socrates teaches Plato, who then teaches Aristotle, SPA. So that's, first one is false. Number two, Aristotle thinks you can build a society where people will never act against the interest of the society for selfish reasons. In effect, every person will be his or her watcher. Again, it sounds right, but if you read it carefully, it's wrong. And it's wrong for the same reason that number one is wrong. It's attributed to the wrong person. Number three, Socrates is found guilty by trial. That's true. And if you don't know that, it's important that now looking back you do. Because remember, what happens is Socrates is kind of an unpopular figure in that he tends to stir things up, right? And when he does, that gets him in trouble. He's ultimately found guilty at trial by his peers and sentenced to death. Number four, Aristotle's criticisms of Plato's Republic focus primarily on the notion of a golden mean. That's true, right? That's true for our class. Look, much of what Aristotle wants to say about Plato can be framed in terms of the golden mean. right? No nuclear family, that's crazy, right? That's not good. We need some middle ground here. We cannot wipe the slate completely clean. We have to, in some way, adhere to norms of conduct that are natural in nature. And for Aristotle, many of those forms of conduct are embodied by this notion of a golden mean, a moderate form of conduct, a moderate amount of a custom or a right that is not so much that it warps other parts of the social fabric. Okay, number 5 is going to be a multiple choice question, and I want you to notice from the get-go, these are long answers. And as you progress in your college career, you'll find out that this tends to happen with multiple choice questions. They tend to be very difficult. So let's just work it as it comes. First thing you want to make sure of when you're reading a multiple choice question is you understand what the question is asking. So this question asks, which of the following best describes the golden mean and applies it to the city reforms Plato proposes? So we got to do 2 things. We've got to find a case where one of these options is going to embody the golden mean, and then it applies to the reforms that Plato wants to give for the city of Callipolis, his imaginary city. So number A, or letter A, virtue comes not from moderation but great extremes. Okay. Initially here, I can tell you this statement is false. That is not what Aristotle thinks, right? He doesn't think that virtue doesn't come from moderation. He thinks virtue does come from moderation. So A is already out. We can knock it off. B, virtue comes from balance with the force, not a superficial immersion in one aspect of it. For example, Obi-Wan Kenobi is spelled wrong, only focused on the light side when he should have understood how the good relates to the dark side. This statement is false because this is not a course on Star Wars, as much as I would love to teach it, right? This is a distractor. And occasionally people pick a distractor, but really they're there to help you even the odds so that you get kind of maybe one freebie, right? 1 or 2 freebies if you're just guessing blindly. So B isn't going to work. So A doesn't work, B doesn't work. Okay, so let's take a peek at C. Virtue comes not from great extremes, but a kind of moderation. For example, rule should be neither an extreme meritocracy, which is rule by the few, nor rule by democracy, rule by all, but rule by the polity, which is rule by middle-class citizens. So far, this is the best answer we've seen, C. I'm not going to say it's the only answer. We'll go down to D. Please make sure when you're taking this exam, you look at all of your options. Anytime you take a multiple choice exam, review all the options before picking one, because very often, and if not virtually always, exams are written that way so that there's one answer that sounds about right, but isn't maybe perfectly right. Now, I don't know that this is going to be the case here. D may be a bad option. I'm pretty sure it is, but you need to make sure before you move forward. So, C, virtue comes not from great adventures, but a kind of personal compromise. For example, someone living in a glass house should not throw stones unless they are soft rubber stones and they're not thrown very hard at all. Okay, so D is absolutely a distractor. C is our best answer, and I would move on. Now, keep in mind, when you see this question on the exam, the options will not be in exactly the same order. There will be the same options, but they're not going to be in the same order, so I encourage you to not just memorize the answer, right? Like, oh, when I see this question, it's going to be C. It may not be C, it may be A. All right. Thrasymachus' notion of justice in the Republic is A, paying your debts, B, helping friends hurting enemies, C, advantage of the stronger, D, harmony. So, in order to answer this question, you have to remember Thrasymachus. And whenever you're trying to remember which one Thrasymachus is, think of the beginning of this word. It's not a root or anything. It's just a way to remember. But remember Thrasymachus. It's the beginning of the word thrash, right? And that's kind of like Thrasymachus. He's coming in there. When he first comes into the dialogue, everybody's like, oh, Thrasymachus, please, please, we're frightened of you. And right, and Thrasymachus is the most combative and assertive of all of Plato's dialogue companions to that point in the Republic. You know, he's very fierce. And so remember, Thrasymachus represents for us the advantage of the stronger. This idea that justice is not really a thing. Justice is getting people who are weaker than you to do what you want, and they like it. That's justice. For Thrasymachus, another way to put it is advantage of the stronger. Okay. And remember, those won't be in the same order, so you'll just have to know them. But a trick is Thrasymachus is kind of like the word thrash, which is very strong. Number 7, Plato, in parentheses Socrates, thinks justice is properly understood as A, paying your debts, B, helping friends hurting enemies, C, advantage of the stronger, D, harmony. You know C is not going to work because we've already answered, so you can knock it out. For this one, Plato thinks justice is going to be properly understood as harmony, right? Having all of the components of the individual in the right proportion and having all the individuals in the society in the right proportion and performing the proper functions, right? The functions at which they are best. Number 8, which one of the following statements best explains the number of charges brought against Socrates and their nature? Now, for this, you're going to need to know not just the number of charges, but the nature of them. Now, I'll tell you that there are two. There are 2 charges, but you're going to need to figure out which of those options, A through E, would be appropriate. So, I will leave that up to you as an exercise, but it should be pretty clear to you. If not, I encourage you to consult your notes. Okay. Number 9. Which of the following statements best describes Socrates' attitude toward poetry? A, he thinks it's the highest form of reasoning. B, he thinks poets should rule and enlighten society because they make the weak argument stronger. C, he thinks poets, quote, know nothing of what they speak. Or D, he thinks poets are second only to painters in terms of great knowledge. Okay. We didn't talk about why this was, but we know that Plato doesn't like poems. He doesn't like poetry because he thinks it's rhetoric. In other words, poetry is a way of manipulating people without regard to truth. And Socrates doesn't like that. He thinks people should be directed toward a higher form of reasoning that concerns itself with the truth. And by truth, we mean what is always and everywhere true rather than what is motivated by prejudice or ignorance. So that is number 9. Number 10, Polemarchus' notion of justice in the Republic is, so we've already run through some of these already. We know it's not harmony, because that's Socrates. We know it's not advantage of the stronger, because that's Thrash, right? Thrasymachus. So it's between A and B. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that the answer here is B, helping our friends and hurting our enemies. Remember, Polemarchus sort of epitomizes this notion of what the French would call l'esprit de corps, or just it's kind of a group spirit, right? This idea of belonging to a group. We might think of it modernly as sports games. Also, it exists in politics, right? People tend to define themselves in terms of a political party or a political stance, right? I am conservative. I am liberal. And they somehow identify with that, and other people who share that label, they identify with those people. They see them as their friends and hurt their enemies. The answer is B. Number 11, Socrates thinks he is blank Athens. A, not important to, B, helpful to, C, comedy relief for, or D, the greatest disco dancer in all of. Obviously, the answer here is D. You get a cat like Socrates on the dance floor and there's no stopping him. He's very good. John Travolta wanted to emulate Socrates. I'm joking. This is a joke. This is a joke. Socrates thinks that he's helpful to Athens. Remember, he understands all too well that what he's doing is causing real problems in that city, but he thinks it's very good for that city to have the voice of dissent. And in fact, that's true. What we know modernly is that regimes tend to make mistakes when they tend to adhere too much to groupthink. They are not willing to invite outside discussion. And so a plurality of opinions and a diversity of opinions is very important to a society. And that's what Socrates sees that long ago. Number 12, Cephalus' notion of justice in the Republic is. Cephalus, remember, our good old Cephalus was the old man that Socrates started talking to about having sex. And it was very awkward. And this is kind of a play on what Cephalus is, right? Cephalus is a person whose desire is, or the appetitive portion of their soul is in the greatest supply. And so they have a thirst for money and food and so forth. And so to someone like that, justice would need to reflect a proper payment of debts. In other words, a fulfillment of borrowing something that was yours. And so our answer is A. Now later on, we'll see Cephalus's notion of justice appear in The Watchmen under the guise of one of the main characters. And this notion of what we'll call later retributive justice, eye for an eye, right? Somebody commits a morally heinous act, they commit a horrible crime, they owe a debt to society at that point. And where we get that notion of justice is from Cephalus. It's from Plato's Republic, ultimately. Okay, now number 13 is going to be short answer and matching. This is, I'll talk about 14 through 17 first. I just wanted to talk for a second about this table. A couple of things. The left-hand side of the table here reflects the kind of life that Socrates is fighting for, the kind of society that Socrates wants, a society in which reason is the highest form of persuasion. It is the greatest force in the society because it's demonstrable to everybody. Questioning is virtuous, right? Not conformity. Asking the questions, not doing what we are told to do. 3, the new virtues of intellect should be valued over virtues of combat. So we should be admiring and holding up smart folks and folks who use their minds rather than people who are big, brawny, force-filled people. Verbal combat is the highest form of resolution. If we have a policy difference about how things should run, whether it's tax or the environment, we can solve these debates by discussing them with one another and coming to some kind of resolution. And last, Plato thinks we should be driven by the universal, what is always and everywhere true, not our own personal prejudices and opinions. These are to be contrasted with what he understands the virtues of Athenian society to be, namely not argumentation, but faith or persuasion is the highest force, right? Questioning isn't virtuous. Reciting verses is virtuous. So for the Athenians, these would be beautiful ancient poems that they would have written by wonderful authors. And those, much like you might hear a Christian or someone quoting the Bible today, or perhaps a Muslim referring to the Quran, this is very often thought to be a virtuous appeal because these are sacred texts which are thought to embody the society's values. But Socrates doesn't want that. He doesn't want to rely on books anymore. He wants questioning to be a virtue of its own. The old virtues of combat, right? You can think of this today when we have military heroes whom we herald because they are so important to us, what they've done for us. In Athenian society, those virtues of combat were praised. Socrates doesn't think that's good. He thinks we should be praising people who are smart and use their intellect rather than people who use brawn. Physical combat is the highest form of resolution for Athenians, and we can see that this way of life ultimately cost them, didn't it? The Athenians entered into the Peloponnesian War. They would have never called it that. And they lost. And this kind of thinking is at least part and parcel what Plato thinks got them there. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, Athenians relied greatly on tradition. And Socrates thinks that this is very dangerous, that we shouldn't rely on tradition. Instead, we should rely on the operation of reason to inform our practices. This later becomes a division between, or just to put it blatantly, modernly, this becomes a division between, very roughly, conservatives who rely on tradition and liberals who are more willing to throw it aside for some sort of new policy, right? Some sort of new experiment. And the thinking is, the deeper arguments here are, conservatives usually appeal to the existence of these traditions to justify them. And they say, look, maybe we don't understand why we do this tradition completely, but it's still around. And it's still around because it works. And reason alone won't always tell us why we do things. And so when in doubt, we should follow the way it's been done successfully in the past. This is in opposition to a different form of thought that Socrates has, which is that tradition, remember when he's criticizing Cephalus at the very beginning, tradition can't always help us with new experiences, right? Tradition can't help us when there is a new context and we can't apply a rule to it. Now, it's not that one or the other of these is wholly correct. It's probably better to think of them as competing forces within our society or within human society at all times. Okay, so how many charges are brought against Socrates? 2. There are 2 charges. Now, this comes from our handout here, which is also posted on Moodle. But I will give you the short and the skinny. 2 charges are brought against Socrates. 1, corrupting the youth. 2, not believing in the gods of Athens. So you can see, right, Socrates is a deeply unpopular figure. Perhaps you like a particular musician or an artist, and sometimes this happens when an artist takes hold, right? They become extremely popular with the youth, and they're thought to be subversive, right? The idea that it's somehow corrupting the youth. Probably one of my favorites of this is D&D, right? Dungeons and Dragons, when it came out, was widely seen by certain groups as being a corrupting or corrosive force in our society rather than a beneficial one. Anytime that happens, if you see a corrupting the youth charge, you know the source was Socrates. He was for us in Western culture anyway, he's considered to be the original voice of dissent, the original voice of principled thought against the mob. Number 15, what does Socrates think of poetry? Well, he hates it. This is part of the Apology where he talks about, I talk to the politicians, and I talk to these people, and I talk to these people, and I talk to the poets. And Socrates essentially talks to these poets, and he says, look, they're wonderful. They are inspired in what they write. It is insightful and it's valuable, but they generally don't know what they're doing, right? That poets don't understand what they're doing. And in that sense, that's quite a condemnation, right? He doesn't think it's useful. And in fact, he's so concerned about poetry that he will restrict its use in education of the guardians. All right, next up. Does Socrates think he is helpful to Athens? Yes. He thinks of himself as a gadfly who bothers the big horse, right? He's that voice of dissent that prohibits a society from becoming too one-sided, from only seeing things from one angle. And so, yes, he thinks he's absolutely helpful to Athens, and he will be difficult to replace if he is gone. And that's true. He never quite was. What is the verdict for Socrates? You should know this. He was condemned, right? He was found guilty, and then he was later sentenced to death. And he drank hemlock. So the verdict is bad. This is relevant. It's important because it helps us understand Plato and why Plato is so extreme. He saw his teacher murdered by the mob. He wants to set up a society where that never happens to him, right? He doesn't want to have to go through that. He doesn't think that a society functioning that way is functionally normally or functioning optimally. All right. We did this matching chart here, so I'm going to zip on here to number 18. Or excuse me, number 19. Now, this is a very long question, and so I'm going to help you here. I'm not going to ask you this question on the exam because it's terribly, terribly long. Well, it's actually not terribly long. I thought I asked for 3. There was a version of this question that was much longer. In what way does Plato use characters to express a concept? You must provide an example from the Republic that demonstrates this point. Specifically, name the character and explain how this character stands in for a concept. Okay. How does Plato use characters to express a concept? Well, really the way to explain this is just to give an example. And so what he does is, for example, at the beginning of the Republic, he talks about his tripartite theory of the soul, and he claims that there are 3 parts to the soul, and when one of these 3 parts is out of balance, it generates a certain kind of person. Now, for some people, this setting will be natural. For others, it should be groomed, right? So, for example, someone who's appetitive component of their soul. We have three, right? We have the appetitive, we have the spirited, which is thumos, and we have reason. Reason is the smallest part, but it is the part that should be on top. So if somebody's appetitive is out of balance, they're going to be like cephalus. They're going to seek riches, money, food, this kind of thing, the things that you have an appetite for. And so this is exactly what cephalus is. He is at the end of his life. He's been successful in business. He's been a successful form of this type of thought, which craves things of the appetite, right? So that would be an example of that. Now you could run that for any of the other examples that we have, Cephalus, Thrasymachus, or Polemarchus, but I just did it there for cephalus. Okay, number 20. What is the myth of the ring of Gyges? In what way does Glaucon think it poses a challenge for Socrates, and what is that challenge? Remember, the myth of the ring of Gyges has a long history in Western culture. It shows up for us in Lord of the Rings. It shows up with us for The Invisible Man. And the idea is that someone could put on a ring, and once they put that ring on, they then become invisible, right? And the idea is there is no oversight here. There's no check on someone's individual desires or passions, and this person should be able to do whatever it is they want to do. And Glaucon says, look, you could give that ring to a virtuous person and a complete scoundrel, and they will both act exactly the same way in their own interest, as they should. Why, Socrates, wouldn't they? Right? And so this poses a challenge for Socrates because he needs to begin to explain how it is or why it is that a person wouldn't act in such a way. Right? So Glaucon's challenge is very... it's formidable because we know modernly that it turns out most people, or Glaucon's probably right, most people aren't virtuous, but they are virtuous when they're being watched, right? Or they think they are being watched. All right, number 21. What does Plato think justice is? One word, you should know it. It's harmony. Remember the example I talked about in class where you have a law firm and everybody at the firm does what they're supposed to do. Maybe one person writes motions, another person handles the books, and a third person brings in clients, right? When you are working, you want everybody working at what they are best at, and that will be best for the group. So that's what harmony is. What is Plato's solutions to Glaucon's challenge? Everyone will become his or her own watchman, and we will educate people in such a way that they will essentially be forced to be virtuous. We will manufacture virtuous people. The state will become a state of virtue. We talked about Cephalus, what his notion of justice is above. The critique of Cephalus's notion of justice is a little tricky, but it is essentially this. Tradition is great, but it doesn't help us when we have new instances, right? And so remember, Socrates talked about, well, suppose I loaned you a knife or something, right? And you want to get your knife back from me, but I happen to know when you ask me for your knife that you're super upset and you're going to go use it to hurt somebody. In such an instance, it would not be just for me to return to you or to pay back your debt. I should hold off on that, right? And so remember the Allen Iverson example, right? His friend held on to his money and didn't give it to him because that's what a friend would do, because he knew that Allen Iverson would go through it. He knew that Allen Iverson was in a fevered state and he wouldn't be acting rationally, and so his friend holds on to his money because that's what friends do. Why is this a critique of justice? Because remember, for Socrates and Plato, justice needs to be universal. And if I can find an exception to your notion of justice, then it is not justice. That's why Socrates' discussion of paying back debts to a madman is a critique of Cephalus' notion of justice, because it serves as a counterexample to it. What is Polemarchus' notion of justice? Remember, Polemarchus was concerned with being groupish, right? Helping your own, hurting the others. It's kind of like politics today, right? Now, what's a critique of this notion? Well, you don't always know who your friends are. You can be mistaken as to who your friends are. And we talked about this in class. We talked about the Jonestown Massacre, right? A group of people who couldn't have been happier, who couldn't have told you all the livelong day about how this congregation was wonderful and Jim Jones was their friend, and yet, in the end, they turned out to be wrong. And so this happens sometimes in political parties, right? People back a candidate or they back a group and they feel like they were betrayed, that this person didn't have their interests at heart. Okay, number 25. What is Plato's tripartite division of the soul? It's this claim that the soul has three parts, and those parts are the appetitive, and reason, and thumos, the spirited part of you. And this relates to Plato's notion of justice in that he thinks justice is going to be harmony of these points, harmony of these parts within an individual, right? Okay. Number 26. Why does Plato think our souls consist of more than one part? Well, we covered this in class, but the basic idea is we very often have conflicting emotions, right? We at once love somebody completely, and yet they are the object of our great anger. If you've ever had children, this is true. If you've ever had siblings growing up, this is true, or parents, right? You love them, but you want to sometimes kill them. And Socrates and Plato say, look, this couldn't both be from the same part. I can't love and hate with the same part in the same way at the same time. And so I have to have different parts to me. I have to have different parts to my soul. All right. What are 5 reforms Plato proposes for the model state? All right. So I've condensed these here into 5. Most scholars call them 3 waves of reform, and that's right. But for these purposes, because we wanted to break things down, I've labeled 5 different reforms here. The first one is education and censorship. And here, Plato wants to restrict, so this is 377b, he wants to restrict access to people who are receiving education, in particular the guardians. And he thinks that that's because if we expose guardians to too much, if we expose people to things too much early on in their education, it will warp them in the same way that you can warp a tree, right? You can force a tree to grow a certain way by bending a very small branch, and then when it later becomes big, it is very difficult to move back. And so we saw examples of education and censorship in the United States. We saw the example of the revisionaries, where you had people who felt like the education of the United States was too secular, and they were trying to combat that by including alternative, what they claimed to be alternative scientific theories. Number 2, a noble lie. He thinks that we need to tell the rulers that they are of a specific kind of metal, that they were mixed with the metal of the earth, and you would have gold folks and silver folks, and then the lowest rung, the copper folks, and so forth. So the idea here is that you would have a noble lie that you would tell all of the society to keep them in check. Now, ironically, this theme of a noble lie, some people think takes place in our society with the notion that all men are created equal. And so people try to marshal evidence for this claim. And they say, look, we really don't think that all men are created equal, and here's why, right? We didn't allow women to vote until 1921, right? We didn't allow African Americans to own property or receive education or have families, right? And the notion that people are created equal is patently false. If they were created equally, they weren't treated equally under the regime. And so for that reason, some people say, well, the United States, like almost all societies, has a noble lie, right? So that would be an example of a modern day instance of this reform. Number 3, no private property. Plato thinks that people shouldn't have things because they become attached to them, and people will become more attached to the things than they do to other people. And that is detrimental to all of us, right? Number 4, there will be no nuclear family and there will be no romantic love. Sex will only be for procreation is only for procreation. You can have sex later when you get much older, Plato thinks. So this is probably one of the most radical reforms that Plato has, right? The idea that you wouldn't have a mother and a father. Instead, your mother and father would be the state. And again, it's to remove attachment to other things or things other than the state. Now, this is almost you might think of this as almost slightly fascist, right? You wouldn't be as attached to your own family as you are now. And there are some historical parallels here. You see instances of children in 1940s Germany who belonged to the Hitler Youth. Their parents were dreadfully afraid to mention anything critical of Hitler because Hitler Youth would report their parents to the authority. Oh, my father said such and such about Hitler at dinner. And so you can see how immediately the binds become more important to the state than they do the family. And this is why some people think of Plato as kind of modeling the first fascist state. Probably not exactly right, but I understand why somebody would say that, right? And then lastly, Plato's reforms, one of the most important to note in your answer is co-education for the guardians. He feels that women should be equal to men with regard to political office. Now, we made exhaustive efforts here to try and show this in the history of philosophy. We showed Antigone and how Greek culture was deeply misogynistic, right? They were deeply anti-female. They felt that, remember the funeral oration of Pericles, that a woman's silence is her crown, right? All of these things reflect a society that doesn't want women to have equal rights with regard to the political process. And they want to try and do everything they can to disenfranchise women from being involved in public life or exerting any power in that arena. So Plato, when he comes out and says, no, women should also be part of the office, that's a huge deal, right? That's a big deal. Now, don't let him off the hook entirely. He still manages to say that women are the weaker of the sexes and so forth. But it's worth noting that he is an early classical thinker for us who thinks this way. Okay, great. So that's your answer to those. What are the 5 reforms? They don't need to be in this order. They can be in whatever order you've got. Okay, number 28. Why does Plato heavily regulate the education system in the Republic? Well, I will tell you why. It's because education influences people and it influences a nation or a state for generations to come, right? So you can see this absolutely when we saw that example with regard to the revolutionaries. If you want to shape the way that a society is going to go, then you need to shape the children that are going to be the people of tomorrow. And so that's why the educational system is so tightly controlled in the Republic, because it will ultimately be the guarantor of a virtuous state. And so that's why it's important, and the people that we educate today will become the rulers of tomorrow. And so if we miseducate them or we don't educate them properly, then they will become dissidents and they will become disenchanted with the system and they will become antithetical to our way of life. So we want to heavily control how it is that they learn and what they learn. Number 29, what is the noble lie that Plato discusses? This is poorly written. What is the noble lie Plato discusses that will exist in the state of Gallipoli? Remember, this is the notion that you would have people belonging to certain castes. You would have a gold caste, a silver caste, and so forth, and that people would need to demur to their betters. So if a guardian thinks I'm supposed to do something and I'm just a worker, I need to do what the guardian tells me I'm going to do. And the noble lie is that those people are inherently superior to myself. And that superiority exists in nature, right? And so I need to abide by that structure. Number 30, what is the role of women within the Republic? Plato thinks that women should be co-rulers, that they should rule alongside men because with regard to politics, there's no difference. Does Plato consider women and men to be equal? With regard to politics, yes. However, remember that last line that he says that in all things women are the weaker of the sexes and so forth. Doesn't quite go all the way, right? He still has to throw in a little bit of control there. He won't afford women total equality, thinks that they're the lesser of the sexes, but he does think with regard to politics, at least, they should be afforded equal say. Kind of an interesting, there might be a little bit of tension there in Plato. Okay, so now we're going to move on to passage identification and explanation. And so for these, you don't need to give me a super long answer, right? But your answer needs to be complete. So let's just take these one at a time. They should be fairly easy for you to identify. I'm not going to be writing out my answers here, but I'll discuss these with you and give you the main idea. All right. 31. Those who persuaded you by using envy and slander, and those who persuaded others after being convinced themselves, all of these are most difficult to get out. For it is also not possible to have any of them come forward here and refute them. So you too must deem it to be as I say. There have been two groups of accusers. This passage is from the defense of Socrates, and it's Socrates explaining the number of charges against him, the number of accusers he's got, and that's two. Very straightforward. Okay, now you know Chaperon, no doubt. He was my comrade from youth as well as a comrade of our multitude, and he shared in your recent exile and returned with you. You do know what sort of man he was, how vehement he was, and whatever he set out to do. And in particular, he once even went to Delphi and dared to consult the oracle about this, and asked whether there was anyone wiser than I, meaning Socrates. The Pythia replied to him that no one was wiser. So here, Socrates goes to or rather his friend goes to the Oracle of Delphi, the religious center of their days, and says, is anybody smarter than Socrates? And she says, no, there isn't. And so Socrates sets off on a course to try and determine whether or not this is true. So this passage is spoken by Socrates in the Apology, and it's discussing how it is Socrates began his journey, right? How he began to question people in the society who were wise. Number 33. All right. I'm going to fast forward through this, right? I'm not going to read this whole one out loud. We'll be here all day. I'm going to fast forward to the last sentence. For they too say many noble things, but they know nothing of what they speak. This is the Apology, and it's Plato talking about poets, right? And he says, almost everyone present would have spoken better than the poets did about the poetry that they themselves have made. So again, also concerning the poets, I soon recognize that they do not make what they make by wisdom, but some sort of nature. And while inspired, like the diviners and those who deliver oracles. He's saying, look, poetry is great, it's fantastic, and it's very moving. But if you stopped and talked to a poet about what they were doing, they wouldn't be able to explain it to you. And that's because it's something like in their nature to produce it. In the same way that it's in the nature of a fire to burn, it's in the nature of these poets to kind of crank this stuff out. And although it's wonderful, they don't understand what they're saying, right? That's what Plato is talking about there. And this is his way to attack the Athenian form of life, which relies upon poets. And then I discover a great abundance, but they know little or nothing, right? For I do not suppose they would be willing to speak the truth, that it becomes quite clear that they pretend to know, but know nothing. All right. Socrates is referring here to his accusers, right? And he's basically saying, look, I talked to a lot of people, okay, and none of them knew anything, right? I mean, these are people who are supposed to know stuff, but none of them did when I would ask them questions, right? And then they would get angry at me and say that I was the one who was corrupting the youth. But I'm just the one who's asking questions, right? And he says, what am I doing that corrupts these youth? All I'm doing is asking questions, right? What am I doing and what am I teaching? They couldn't begin to say. And so this is just a way for Socrates to try and display the vacuousness of the criticisms against him. All right, I wouldn't look for that one on the exam. Number 35. What are the charges against Socrates? And these are just listing them here. Corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods of the city of Athens. But I do know that it's bad. And, okay, we're just going to skip past this one. Yeah, we'll skip number 36. In fact, I'm going to just wipe it out. This has to do with Socrates and who he's going to obey, but we're not going to get into that. I won't ask you guys that. Okay. All right, number 36, right? So I, men of Athens, am now far from making a defensive speech on my own behalf, as someone might suppose. I do it rather on your behalf, so that you do not do something wrong concerning the gift of a God to you by voting to condemn me. This is Socrates explaining how valuable he is to Athens. And he says, look, I'll go ahead and give my speech, but it's not going to be because I need to give a speech for my own benefit. It's for your benefit, because if you kill me, you're harming yourselves, because I serve a function here that you don't yet appreciate or understand, right? So this is from the Apology, and this is Socrates, and he's explaining how he's actually good for Athens, right? All right. Okay, so we have this full, complete passage here. Okay, and this is essentially the same thing. It's the full passage, though. And at the end, he says here, then you would spend the rest of your lives asleep, unless the gods send you someone else in his concern for you. In other words, if you kill me, you're all going to be asleep for the rest of your days, and you won't even know it, right? I'm the one keeping you all woke here. I'm the one who's making things. I'm giving you the critical reflection that you need to run a society. And unless God sends you somebody after I'm dead, you're going to be asleep forever. All right. Now, number 38. We talked about this in class. And it's actually a very interesting passage. But this is Socrates in the Apology talking about what should we do with your kids, right? What would you do for your children, right, when I'm gone? And he says, reproach them, just as I did you. Tell them that they do not care for the things that they should, and that they suppose they are something when they are worth nothing. And if you do these things, we will have been treated justly by you. Okay, this is fascinating. Socrates wants his children to be raised within the society. He doesn't want them ostracized for his deeds. And what this means is, to Socrates, it's far more important. I mean, when you step back from it, his thinking here is, look, it's far more important that my children are raised to be good citizens. That's what I really want, right? I want my children to have my values, and I want them to be part of this community. And if you do that, we're square, right? It's fine. No harm done. You killed me. It's fine. You treated my kids right. You did right by me, and you did right by Athens. And that's what's most important to Socrates. All right. Number 39. This is how Plato responds to Glaucon. He says, look, everybody's going to become his or her own watchman, and they will not attach themselves to the greatest of evils, because they will know what the greatest of evils are. And if you know what evil is, you will never do it. To know what goodness is to do goodness. And if you don't do goodness, then you don't actually know it. All right. Number 40. This is Plato here discussing. This is from the Republic. And number 39 was also from the Republic. I'm so sorry. The little quotes are on there too, the little Stephanus numbers. So here we are, number 40. This is Plato talking about the tripartite division of the soul. So this is from the Republic. This is Plato talking about the three parts of the soul and how we have conflicting emotions and different ways of being, and these different ways of being can't all be in one thing, so our soul must have more than one part. All right, number 41. All right. It looks to me, so I'll skim through this one. It looks to me as though the investigation we are undertaking is no ordinary thing, but one for a man who sees sharply. Since we're not clever, we should make this kind of investigation. If I had someone who ordered men they don't see very sharply to read letters from afar, Okay. He says, look, we're going to create, in this passage, we're going to create a city. And we're going to create a sort of big screen image of what justice is. So we'll look at justice in the individual, and then we'll look at justice within the state. And the reason why is it's easier to understand justice. It will become more apparent to us when we can see its constituent parts writ large in a society. And so this is a passage from the Republic where Plato is talking about why we would discuss a city-soul state. And it's for clarity of thought, right? Ultimately, he thinks it will become easier to understand his project if we look at it in this way. All right, number 42. This is from the Republic. Okay, here we go. They will begin by taking the state and the manners of men, from which, as from a tablet, they will scrape clean the picture and leave a clean surface. It sounds like a very nice, sort of innocent reference to a metaphor of scraping a picture clean and leaving a clean surface, but it's actually pretty radical. This idea that you would take an existing society, completely reorganize it, and scrape it clean of its values in order to start anew. So this is Plato's idea of, so this is from the Republic, and this is Plato explaining why and how we're going to start the state anew. We're going to get rid of the bad influences and construct an ideal state. All right, number 43. This is a passage concerning education. And Plato believes that we can justify, here, he thinks that we can justify severely censoring education and restricting the things that people are exposed to, right? So he says here, shall we then permit our children without scruple to hear any stories composed by any authors whatever? No, we shall not permit it on any account. And the beginning is the most important part of every work. And here, I don't know how that H got in there. Here he's saying, look, the beginning of someone's education is crucial. And if you poison them at the beginning, that poison will stay in the dye, right? This person will be wrong from the beginning. And so we need to start properly, and we need to restrict access to the things that people learn. All right. Number 44. This is Ta-Nehisi Coates reflecting on his own education. And he says, some years after I left school, after I dropped out of college, I heard a few lines from Nas that struck me. Ecstasy, coke, you say it is love, it is poison. School where I learned they should be burned, it is poison. It's exactly how I felt back then. I sensed the schools were hiding something, drugging us with false morality so that we would not see. So this is a passage from Ta-Nehisi Coates, and here he's reflecting upon his own education and how he feels like his own education was the impartment or the bestowal of a kind of false morality on him, to conform, to do things a certain way, to learn French for no apparent reason, right? And so he says here, this is very crucial. I loved a few of my teachers, but I cannot say that I truly believed any of them. That is a very, very powerful statement about one's education and the role that it plays in your lives. And so if you see this one, make sure you tell me who it is, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and what's the point of it? He's reflecting on his education and how he feels like his education was closer to propaganda. It was closer to forcing somebody into a mold than it was feeding a plant, right? We should think of education as the plant within a seed, not a person hammered into a certain mold. Okay, that does it for our mock exam. Now, if you are taking the exam and you have questions, something isn't right, it doesn't make sense, you run out of time, email me and I can totally work with you. Give yourself enough time to get this done, and do it early. Don't wait to the end, because if some problem comes up, then you'll be stuck and you'll need to fix it. Okay, you guys, I hope that was helpful and I hope it was a good video. I tried to make it as clear as possible and as quick as possible. Good luck on the exam. Email me if you have any questions.